Today's session is going to be hybrid, and even our speakers today are hybrid. So we have Jonathan here presenting in person, and we have Sachin presenting from India. Um, all our sessions will be recorded, posted on the Pinfo YouTube channel, as well as you can access this link from the Pinfo website, Pinfo Lab website. The title for today's session is Adjusting for Lead and Length Time Bias in Cancer Screening. And I'm going to give a brief intro of our speakers today, and then I could give the floor to you guys. So Sachin is an intern in the lab and is currently pursuing his MS in biology from IISER, which is the Indian Institute of Science Education and Research in Mohali. His previous experience is in computational and numerical modeling for biological phenomena. Jonathan has a bachelor's degree in computer science from UT Austin. After graduating, he worked as a web developer for 2 years before deciding he would like to try out doing research full-time. Currently, he is planning on pursuing a PhD at some point in the future and will be joining Dr. Coombs' lab full-time this July. He grew up in Houston and is a big fan of the diverse food scene in the city and Rockets basketball. So the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Michelle. So our presentation today is titled Adjusting for Lead and Lifetime Bias in Cancer Screening. So cancer screening the aim of cancer screening is to detect cancer before symptoms appear. Whenever symptoms do appear for cancer, usually it is much harder to treat and outpatient outcomes tend to be much worse. So any action that can be taken to detect it early, to start treatment early, is very advantageous for patients. Routine screening is usually recommended for people with high risks for certain cancers, but unfortunately, the screening comes with drawbacks. It can be cost time and money, and certain screening procedures can be invasive or cause health risks in and of themselves. So that's why it is important to appropriately estimate how effective cancer screening is, so we know whether or not the outcomes that it results in are worth the costs. So certain aspects of screening for cancer inherently cause bias in data that's collected about the patients. We want to remove this bias as much as possible to have accurate representations of the outcomes that the patients are having after they have their cancer detected. Two of these biases are named lead time bias and length time bias. Now I'm going to hand the presentation over to Sachin so he can tell you more about these two.
So if we can go to the next slide. Yeah. So the lead time bias refers to the perceived survival time being higher in the case of cancer detected through screening. So here we can see two cases where two hypothetical people, both with the same cancer progression, but for the first person, the cancer was detected through screening at an earlier time, whereas for the second person, the cancer was detected through symptoms at a later time. Even though the progression of the cancer was the same for both people, the perceived survival time for the person who was detected in screening is higher due to the lead time also being counted in the survival time. Whereas for the person for whom cancer was detected through symptoms, the perceived survival time is lesser. So this can lead, screening to seem to be effective, whereas it actually makes no difference to the survival. The other bias which we'll be talking about in the next slide is called the length time bias. The length time bias describes a phenomenon where less aggressive cancers, which are slow developing, are more likely to be screen detected because they have a longer asymptomatic period where they are screen detectable but are not but are unlikely to be diagnosed through symptoms. Due to this, there is an overrepresentation of less aggressive cancers in screen detected data, and this again makes screen detection appear to be effective, whereas it is just a form of selection bias where the screen detection selects on less aggressive cancers over more aggressive cancers. Um, so going to the next slide. So so one of the landmark papers in adjusting for lead time is written by Duffy and collaborators, and presenting the method that they have used. They have adjusted the lead time bias for the people with cancer for whom cancer was detected through screening. Uh, what's important to note here is that there are some patients who are undergoing regular screening because they are at risk. But let's say the screening happens on a yearly basis. So let's say a person is getting screened every January. It is possible that the cancer was not present in January or was not significant in January during screening. But then they develop symptoms, let's say towards December, where the cancer has become more severe, and now they are diagnosed not through the screening but independent of screening. So even a person undergoing regular screening for whom the cancer was not detected through screening, for such a person, the lead time bias will not apply. Um, However, in practice, it's very difficult to know. Like if you're looking at the data, it's very difficult to know whether a person's cancer was detected through screening or whether it was detected uh, between screenings. So, in order to differentiate this, the method which we found was taken by Kareem and collaborators was uh, looking at those who received screening 6 months prior to diagnosis. So let's say the diagnosis happened in March. So you would look at the 6 months preceding March, and only those who had screening in the 6 months preceding March would be considered as would be considered for adjusting for lead time bias. In another paper, we found that they had used an additional filter, which was uh, people who had screening with intent within 6 months before diagnosis, where they use certain other parameters in the Medicare data to see if uh, the screening was specifically for this form of cancer. So going to the next slide. Uh, so the way Duffy and collaborators decide to tackle this problem is that they estimated the lead time for every single patient and then removed that the estimated lead time from the perceived survival time. So, so these are the formulae which they came up with. The derivations are present at the end of the presentation if any of you are interested. But the important thing here to note is that for every patient, the formula depends on whether they are known to be dead or known to be alive at the last uh, point at which data is available. And the estimated lead time depends only on two things: how long the patient, it depends only on the observed survival time and the mean sojourn time. And the sojourn time here refers to the time spent in the preclinical detectable phase. That is, it is detectable, but then it is detectable in screening, but then would not show symptoms yet. Uh, And this sojourn time is obtained from literature, whereas the survival time is calculated for each patient individually. So, in the next slide, uh, this is the formula for the adjusted survival time. So, the adjusted survival time for each patient is given by their perceived survival time and then subtracting the estimated lead time. So, as we can see again in the diagram, in this case, what we are trying to do is that we are trying to remove the estimated lead time for the person who's detected through screening in order to make their survival time comparable to the survival time of those whose cancer was detected through symptoms. So one thing which is interesting to note is that the estimated survival time due to the nature of the formula will never be greater than the perceived survival time, due to which the adjusted survival time will always be positive. Also, uh, the adjustment is performed at the beginning before any analysis is done, and all the analysis is performed on the adjusted survival time to obtain relative hazard, relative risk, etc., using Cox regression or Kaplan-Meier analysis. So this is the summary on how lead time bias is done. So for the length time bias, it has some key differences with compared to how lead time bias is calculated. In the case of length time bias, the calculation is performed on the aggregate data rather than for each individual patient. So this method directly estimates the relative risk and relative hazard when comparing screening and for comparing patients with screening and patients without screening. So, the methodology followed is in the following slides. Uh, so the model for length bias is based on a mathematical model that assumes that there are only two distinct types of cancer. There are aggressive tumors and there are slow-growing tumors. The aggressive tumors are assumed to progress faster, because of which they are less likely to be detected through routine screening, and they're assumed to be more severe, due to which they're more likely to cause death. Similarly, for the slow-growing tumors, it's assumed that they progress slowly, due to which they are more likely to be detected through routine screening, and that they are also less severe. So they are also less likely to cause death. So looking at it in more detail, in the Duffy and collaborators classify this as category A and category B tumors. So category A tumors, which are the aggressive tumors, are assumed to make up a Q proportion of the population, where and 1 minus Q will be the proportion of the population within category B. That is what 1 minus Q is the slow growing tumor and Q is the fast growing tumor. Um, in some literature, in the literature which we followed, the estimate for Q which was used was around 20%. So around 20% was the assumed to be the amount of population with aggressive and 80% with a slow growing tumor. The probability of being detected in screening is represented by PS in the case of aggressive tumor, and they've used this factor theta to represent the relative likelihood of screen detection for category A versus B. So since category A is assumed to be PS probability, category B, the probability of being detected for category B will be PS by theta. Similarly, probability of death from symptomatic tumor, category A is the variable assigned has been P, and for category B, we assume that the probability will be theta times P. And there is actually no specific reason to assume that the ratio of probability of screen detection would be the same as the ratio of probability of death, but then for simplicity of the model this was assumed. Similarly, for probability of death from screen detected tumor, it is represented with phi times P, where phi is the relative risk of death. And for category B, it is phi times theta P. Again, because probability of death from symptomatic tumor is considered to be theta P. So going to the next slide. So what we saw previously are all the variables which are used in building the mathematical model, but of course, not all of them are observable. So the observable variables from the data which we have are the observed probability of cancer death for symptomatic tumors. So this is usually done for any specific year. So let's say you're looking at 1 year survival or 3 year survival or 5 year survival. You would calculate a separate P1 for each of them. So similarly, we calculate a P2, which will be the 3 or 5 year survival related probability of cancer death for screen detected tumors. P3 will be the overall probability of screen detection. So it gives the ratio of the population whose cancer was screen detected versus symptomatic. R was the variable they used to designate the observed relative risk of cancer death. So this is just the observed relative risk because we haven't yet adjusted for the length bias. One thing important to note is that all of these steps are done after the lead time bias correction is done. So the lead time bias correction is the first step which happens to the raw data itself, after which the P1, P2, P3 are calculated. Theta and Q, which were mentioned in the previous slide, are both estimated from literature. And they represent again relative risk of death from slow growing tumors with aggressive tumors. And Q represent proportion of tumors which are aggressive. These cannot be observed directly from the data. So if you go to the next slide, so ultimately the whole model boils down to this. So as someone who's implementing the model, this is what is most relevant to us is are these three formulae. The first one is the estimated death rate for aggressive tumors, which is given by this formula. And you can see that this formula depends only on the observed variables from the previous slide, which are P1, P2, P3, and Q theta. We then estimate the relative risk of death with a similar formula, and then with the assumption of exponential distribution, we can estimate the relative hazard of screen detected versus symptomatic tumors. Now, since Q and theta are estimates obtained from literature, we normally use a range of assumed values for both Q and theta so that you can get a likely range of true values for your estimated relative risk and estimated relative hazard. Moving on, hand over to Jonathan to go through an example of the analysis.
So this is an example that we created to illustrate lead and length time bias. This diagram represents 20 patients, 10 patients represented by yellow circles, and 10 patients represented by blue circles. Each of them are screened at the time indicated by the green lines. And the yellow patients represented by yellow circles have the more aggressive form of cancer. The sojourn time for the yellow patients is 2 months, and for blue patients is 4 months. And the survival time after symptoms present themselves without treatment is 2 months for yellow circle patients and 3 months for blue circle patients. Across the whole example, if cancer is screened for and caught, then it adds 3 months of survival time. So in this example, these are some figures that represent the survival times of the symptomatic patients versus the screen detected patients. So as you can see in the example, there's many more blue circle patients that are screen detected than yellow circle patients. So this skews, along with lead time bias, skews the data in favor of screening being highly effective. Whereas if using the true information calculations, we can see that it is only an additional 3 months of survival time, whereas in the observation, it appears to be 5 months of survival time. So the orange line represents time where the cancer is asymptomatic and screen detectable. For each patient that the cancer is not screen detected, the line turns to red. So this means that they will not have any additional survival time, even if the red line crosses the screening barrier, because they've already been diagnosed. So they did not get treatment early. They will not have the additional 3 months. If it turns into purple at the screen time, that means they did get screen detected. They will have 3 additional months of survival time, and they will have better patient outcomes. So this red circle represents the lead time for this patient that I've taken as an example. So the red circle represents time that would not be measured or observed if the patient was not screen detected. So because of this time, and there are other times for all patients that are screen detected, the detection seems more effective than it actually is. So in this data, the average lead time observed is 1.67 months. So in order to remove this data, we want to subtract 1.67 months from each of the screen detected patients in order to compensate for this extra observed time that is not actually useful. So if you take this 1.67 figure out of the 7.33 estimated survival time for screened patients, you get a symptomatic survival time of you get 5.67 for screened survival time patients, and then if you take the symptomatic survival time out of that, you get 3.42, which is much closer to the actual figure of 3. So this is the equation for calculating lead time bias. Because we have perfect information in this example we created, we can just subtract the lead time bias out of each of the screen detected patients. But because normally you do not have perfect information about the entire data set, this equation Duffy observed from a previous researcher, but he writes about it in his paper, is normally used to calculate lead time bias. So in this example, lambda is the rate of transition from cancer from asymptomatic to symptomatic, and the sojourn time is 1 over lambda. Lambda is expected to be an exponential distribution. So in this example data, it is not an exponential distribution. It's just whatever, to be honest. But
you have all the details right, so why didn't you make it?
Time constraints.
Okay.
So in this example, for a patient with a rate of transition of 0.25 and with a survival time of 9, you fill in all of these numbers into the equation and run it through the calculations, and then you would get a survival time of 2.94. So this is much larger than the actual, or you get a lead time of 2.94, sorry. This is much larger than the actual lead time because of the exponential distribution versus just the mock data that we created. So an example for length time bias calculation, this is describing an example for a length time bias calculation. So in this scenario, again, since we have perfect information, these variables that are typically estimated are just going to be filled in with information we know to be true. And then there's variables that will be calculated from the observed data that we know is technically not true. Also, length time bias is typically calculated after lead time bias is already taken out. So that is the figures that we'll be using these calculations. Duffy mentions that in order for it would seem that taking the lead time out before you calculate lead time could cause issues, but the lead time would have to be so irrationally large for that to actually have an effect that it doesn't actually matter. So this is the equation you use for length time bias calculations. We know that half of the patients have the more aggressive cancer and half of them do not. And we have the relative risk for the less aggressive cancer based on the survival times. And we have the observed average survival time for patients who are diagnosed with cancer instead of screen detected. And we also have the mean survival time for patients that have their cancer detected. And we have the likelihood of cancer being screened. So once again, when you fill all of those values into this equation, you get a corrected relative risk value of approximately 0.438. So if we compare the relative risk values for all the different scenarios that we've observed today, with no correction, with the 7.33 and 2.25 values, we get a relative risk of 0.307, which is very far off of the true relative risk, which you can see down here is 0.45. When we take the lead time correction out, the lead time value of 1.67, we get a relative risk of 0.397, which is much closer to 0.45. And then when you take both out, you get 0.438, which is even closer still. So there are some limitations with these bias correction techniques. Lead time bias is generally more reliable because the only hazy variable you have to come up with is the lambda, which you can use by doing literature searches and estimating it that way, which is much more reliable than estimating all of the various variables in the length time bias. So for length time bias, there are many variables to estimate. And because of that, typically extensive sensitivity analysis is conducted in order to capture all of the possible scenarios that could be contributing to length time bias. And additionally to that, as Sachin mentioned earlier, the theta value is used in both the increase in screen detectability and the decrease in fatality. This is in order to simplify the calculations within a reasonable difficulty, but this is not actually true of these two characteristics. It's just they're related to each other, but they're not going to be necessarily perfectly proportional. But Duffy emphasizes that we know length time bias exists, so it's important to try and correct for it, but there are Despite these limitations, his method is still pretty successful at trying to estimate it and remove it. These are the citations for the 3 papers we've used in this presentation. This is Duffy's paper, Dr. Choi's paper, and Dr. Cream's paper. And that's the end of our presentation. Thank you for attending. Thank you for watching if you're online. And I'm open to questions now.
Question. Presentation was excellent. Everybody understood everything. Is that what I'm hearing? Okay, well, thank you. I thought it was a pretty good presentation. Do you want to cut the recording if we're recording now?
Yeah.
You don't have any questions?